Hello. Good evening, Theovlogy friends in Indonesia. Welcome to Theovlogy episode 191. Today, we're going to talk about Paul and the Empire. And our first special guest is Professor Edo Maier, Professor of New Testament and Early Christian Studies at Vancouver School of Theology. And we honor that you can join our conversation today, Professor Maier. And we're also grateful because we are accompanied by Iman Zandroto, a wonderful student from the Vancouver School of Theology. And today, I am also accompanied by two of my friends, Nindyo and also Perdian. And I will introduce both of our special guests today. So first, Professor Maier, he has served two parishes of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada, in Victoria and Delta, British Columbia, from 1991 to 1993. He was a postdoctoral research fellow at Vancouver School of Theology and the University of British Columbia. He has been a full-time member of VST's faculty since 1994. Dr. Maier is fellow of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, University of Heidelberg, was Father Edo Gatto Chair at St Francis Xavier University in 2003, and honorary professor at the University of Exeter in 2009. He published in a variety of areas, including the representation of violence in Antiquity, ancient and contemporary apocalyptic theology, eco-theology and the New Testament, Roman imperial iconography, and New Testament theology, the social meaning of clothing in Antiquity, 2nd century Christianity, and especially Ignatius of Antioch and 1 Clement, and heresy and Christian diversity in the 4th and 5th centuries. Dr. Maier writes and edits numerous articles and books. Two of the recent publications is New Testament Christianity in the Roman World, Essential of Biblical Studies, and it's published in Oxford University Press, and editing Seeing the God, Image, Space, Performance, and Vision in the Religion of the Roman Empire, Politics, Culture, and Religion in the Greco-Roman World. Once again, it is an honor for us, Dr. Maier, for welcoming you in our discussion today.
Thank you.
And for our second special guest, our joy is greater because one of Professor Maier's students, Iman Zandroto, is joining us today. Yay! Iman is an Indonesian student in PhD and pursuing his master's degree in Old Testament. Is I correct? I
Yes,
met with Iman. Correct. Yes, cool. I met with Iman in the annual meeting from Indonesian Theological Association last year, where he was presenting an excellent paper there. Cool. And this is my introduction, and glad to see you both here. And Professor Maier, the time is yours.
Okay.
And yep, please.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you to Iman for helping to arrange this. It's a delight to talk to you all. And I know that I'm especially talking to Indonesian students, and it's really a delight to talk to your Indonesian audience. We have a number of Indonesian students at our school, and we have a number of contacts at different Indonesian schools as well. So it's really, really wonderful to be able to talk to you. Now, I have a kind of a wide breadth of expertise here. So, but generally speaking, where my expertise lies is looking at the social world of early Christianity. And I especially work in the later New Testament writings. So this would be from the later Pauline New Testament writings, so Colossians, Ephesians, 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus, And then I range into other second century extra-canonical literature, so-called apostolic fathers. So, but I'm really interested in the social world of early Christianity. And that's kind of where I've been writing, and that's where I've been doing my research. So I thought I would talk to you a little bit about Paul and Empire, and that then will hopefully lead into discussion about my book, New Testament Christianity in the Roman World. So I'm going to be talking about my here's a shameless advertisement for my other book. You should go buy this. It's an extremely important book. This is called Picturing Paul and Empire, Imperial Image, Text, and Persuasion in Colossians, Ephesians, and the Pastoral Epistles. So really the emergence of the study of Paul and the Roman Empire actually began in the 19th century, where it was motivated by archaeological discoveries of inscriptions and so on. And there was a book by Adolf Deismann, which is in the English title is called Light from the East. And where Deismann in the late 19th century, this book went through many, many editions. And the English edition that you can find, Light from the East, is I think the edition of around 1925. Or it might be 1910 or 1925, I can't remember. But anyway, what was happening is that these German archaeology was really in its heyday at the time. And so there were all these discoveries that were coming out, and people were discovering coins, and they were discovering inscriptions. And one inscription that was very, very important that was discovered was the Priyani Inscription in the city of Priyani, which is just south of ancient Ephesus on the west coast of Asia Minor, or contemporary Turkey, which was an inscription that was celebrating the establishment of a cult to the Emperor Augustus on account of all of the wonderful things that he had done for the world. And so Deismann and others then noticed the kinds of parallels of language. For example, Augustus's reign is called a gospel. In fact, Augustus's reign is called the beginning of the good news, right? The beginning of a gospel about somebody who brought peace to the world and is a son of God. And so now they're going to be worshiping him as a son of God. And so on and so forth. So that was very, very important. So scholars began to notice, it's just not the Hebrew scriptures that we should be relating the Paul to, but we should also be ranging more widely. So now fast forward into the 1990s, and then comes the Gulf War, the first American Gulf War. And in the wake of the first American Gulf War, there's a lot of people who are obviously horrified by this. And so Richard Horsley from Boston University and a few others, they originated a seminar called the Paul and Politics Group at the Society of Biblical Literature, in which they were wanting to, again, explore the relationship of Paul to the empire, the Roman Empire. And the result of that seminar was 4 volumes called Paul and Politics, 4 different volumes, all edited by Horsley under differing aspects. Now, I bring all of this up because the interest here was really to develop a motif of Paul, who was somebody who was really opposed to the Roman Empire. And so you have a kind of a binary. You have the empire over here, and you have Paul over here. And Paul is largely opposed to the Roman Empire. There's no idea that Paul is in any way for the Roman Empire or anything like that. Then the main message that the Paul and Politics group developed was also developed by John Dominic Crossan and Jonathan Reed in a book on Paul the Apostle and the Roman Empire, in which they also brought forward this archaeological evidence that had been discovered in the 19th century and brought it forward again, and now really represented a profile of Paul who basically got up every morning and wondered about hating the Roman Empire and how bad the Roman Empire really is. And so really whose gospel was really in a very, very important way dedicated to the opposition to the Roman Empire. Now, sometimes when I say, when you read Crossan and you read Paul in the Roman Empire, every time that Paul says the Roman Empire, you should replace the words Roman Empire with white evangelical America and the Republican Party. And then you kind of get the scope. So a lot of the problem with the scholarship is that it's politics, and this is, of course, a problem with hermeneutics in general. How much does our present location shape the ways in which we come to an ancient text? And Horsley and Crossan and others have been part of a establishment or a part of Christianity that is very much wanting to be critical of American government, American foreign policy. And my argument would be that just under the surface of the scholarship, not very far below the surface of the scholarship, is actually something else that's going on, which is a kind of an American culture war that's going on between more liberal trends within American society and more conservative trends within American society. And the more conservative trends are, as we know from the recent, from the last election of Donald Trump and now the present election of Donald Trump, is one in which white, especially white evangelical Americans, are opposed to more liberal currents within society. And of course, with Ginsburg's death just yesterday, this is now, of course, going to come up and be even more important as an element in the current American election because of the opposition to abortion, homosexuality, in favor of racial segregation, in favor of Christian private schools, and on and on and on. Right. So when I wrote my book, so all of that is like a preface to where my books are really situated here. So my work is really situated to really contest this entire way of looking at things. Sometimes I say this, that just as we can say, for example, that we're opposed to capitalism, but given the present economic structure of the world, no matter which part of the world you're in, unless you are living in some village that is still engaged in barter in some way, but generally speaking, the vast majority of the world is implicated in capitalism. And you can be sort of opposed to capitalism, but you can't really say, but it's very difficult to imagine a kind of an order that is outside of capitalism, right? And so, and if we say we're opposed to capitalism, I mean, we would want to then say, well, we're opposed to capitalism in this regard. It's in this regard of capitalism that we're opposed to it. So, but it's hardly possible for us to say, I wake up every morning and I'm opposed to capitalism just as a general kind of strategy, right? I mean, that would be a very, very difficult thing. And rather, I think that what we're really talking about is we're talking about the ways that we're entangled within capitalism and the ways that we seek to live within capitalism in a way that expresses our identity, our belief system, and so on and so forth. So I think that rather than talking about Paul being opposed to the Roman Empire, it makes rather more sense to talk about Paul being engaged with the Roman Empire. And Paul is a citizen of the Roman world. He's a Roman citizen, according to the book of Acts. And so he relies on the Roman Empire to preach his gospel. He draws on Roman imperial language to preach his gospel. So the language, again, of his gospel, which is an imperial term, the language of peace, for example, where Paul says in Colossians, or the writer of Colossians, depending upon your view on the authorship, says that God has made peace with us through the blood of Christ. And the word there, peace, even Jesus is called a peacemaker, the one who has made peace, irene poios. is itself a political slogan that where Roman Empire emperors were celebrated for making peace. Um, and Paul talking about Jesus, the Son of God, I think also has resonances with an imperial ideology. And I don't think that Paul is using this language to oppose the Roman Empire. I think Paul is rather drawing on this language in order to make his gospel persuasive to people who are living in these urban contexts. And in drawing on this language, he's basically adopting the language, and as I say, he's trying to make his message more persuasive, in the same way that a contemporary preacher, when they're preaching, will use the language of culture to express the religious ideals that they're wanting to present in a sermon. So this suggests that Paul is much more implicated in the Roman Empire than those who would say that he's opposed to the Roman Empire would want to believe. And so we need to then talk about how Paul's language, or even we need to talk about how the implications of Paul's gospel are a challenge to Roman imperial authority. Paul is apocalyptic. I think that contrary to other New Testament scholars, for example, Tom Wright, who would resist the idea that Paul is apocalyptic, I think that Paul is apocalyptic. And Paul believes that the present order is coming to an end, that there's going to be a dramatic coming to an end of the present, of his present political order, and something else will take its place. But in order to talk about something which is actually inexpressible, because how could we talk about that because we're not there, Paul rather uses the imagery of the world around him to try to invite his imagination, his audiences to imagine this. Now, in my book, Picturing Paul and Empire, which has, by the way, this is a great book for you to buy for Christmas, for example. It has all sorts of pictures inside of it. And what I do in this book is I try to show how Paul uses vivid language of description to get his point across. So the majority of his listeners are not literate. And so they're not sitting down with a concordance and reading Paul's letters in the way that a theology student would in a contemporary school of theology or something like that. They are rather living in an oral culture and an oral culture. And so when Paul writes his letters, he's writing them so that they will create a vivid set of images in the minds of the people who are listening to his what he has to say in his letters, right? And there is a strategy of ancient persuasion that is called ekphrasis, which means vivid speech. And people who were learning how to do rhetoric in the ancient world, they learned all about how to use vivid speech, or ekphrasis. And they argued that ekphrastic speech or vivid speech should be used in such a way to create vivid images in the minds of listeners, so that these vivid images will then evoke a set of emotions and a set of personal responses, right? So this is quite different from maybe the way that the later Protestant tradition has tended to read the Bible really closely, lexicographically, syntactically, with really, really close scrutiny on verb tenses and so on and so forth. And so it's been a very rational, cognitive way of understanding the text. But this other way of thinking about the text is more in a much more emotionally laden way. In other words, how has a writer like Paul, or we can talk about Matthew, Luke, whatever, but how have New Testament writers arranged the text to create a vivid impression in the minds of their listeners? And one of the ways that Paul seeks to make a vivid impression on the minds of his listeners is to create these striking images. And these striking images, then, he draws on the repertoire of the lived world around the audience. in ancient rhetorical handbooks. For example, Quintilian, who wrote a set of instruction manuals on the use of rhetoric, said that when using vivid speech, the images should not depart very far away from the everyday experiences of the listeners. So if we take that point in mind, and we notice that there's political language in Paul, then we should pay attention to the world around these people living in these urban contexts and the way that the urban world around them shaped their imagination. And one of the ways that the urban world shaped the imagination of ancient people was visually. So the ancient world and people who live outside of North America, people who live in Asia, for example, where, or let's say India, for example, where there is religious iconography everywhere. Everywhere you look, there is religious iconography. And there is no aspect of life that is not in one way or another wound up or intertwined with religion and gods and so on and so forth. I mean, I was in Singapore, for example, and I mean, it was striking to me that I would see statues of gods and people laying out food in the morning and burning incense to the gods. That's not something that you see in North America or in Germany when you're walking down the road very often. And so this long Protestant, Northern European, American tradition of New Testament scholarship, which is very lexicographically and syntactically focused, neglects to attend to these visual aspects and the embeddedness of visual culture in Paul's world. So if we come back then to the question of vivid speech and imagination and the sort of omnipresent frequency of iconography to the emperor, to the gods, or whatever, then I think that we begin to recognize the role that this vivid language had to play in Paul's letters. Paul is wanting to create not only Paul persuades and communicates by creating images of Jesus' triumph, the coming end of the age, what Jesus has achieved, what the resurrection is, how they should be a community together. He uses political terms, and these political terms are couched in iconography, and this iconography then is part of the urban world. And Paul is using all of this language in order to make his message as appealing as possible, as understandable, and as instructive as possible to the urban audiences of his world. And of course, the consequence of this is that on the one hand, this can be very radical, right? This can be very, very radical. I mean, saying sometimes is that you use the emperor's tools to deconstruct the emperor, right? You use the emperor's tools, and you use the tools as a weapon against the emperor to undermine the emperor, and you beat the emperor kind of at his own game. And that's a very, very important, I think, strategy that Paul uses. But of course, what happens is that when you draw on political iconography and you draw on political language from a dominant culture, right? And this then becomes in time the definitive language, the language that defines your movement, right? When the founder dies or when the generation dies, this language has an effect of creating a much more conservative relationship with the political order around yourself, because of course the political language has been endorsed, and the political language now being endorsed begins to take on its own logic and begins to generate another set of consequences that were completely unintended by the original author or by the original generation. And this is pretty important because what happens is that the New Testament is really filled with this kind of political imperial language. Now, when we come then to the 4th century, and we see an emperor first tolerating Christianity under Constantine, and then at the end of the 4th century under Theodosius, making Christianity, Catholic Christianity, let's say pro-Nicene Christianity, the only legitimate religion of the Roman Empire. We can see how the political language has come full circle and is now creating another reality, namely that all of this political language now is being understood as endorsing, supporting, and legitimating forms of imperial rule, right? Which really was not really intended. Paul did say that people ought to pray for the emperor, and at least in 1 Timothy to pray for the emperor, but in Romans chapter 13, Paul says to obey the emperor and to pay taxes. And so on. So Paul was not calling for a revolution against the Roman Empire, but Paul really did not imagine an imperial order that would be, as it were, Christian. But the Bible itself, the New Testament itself, because all of its political language, I think that political powers begin to recognize themselves in this language. And in the middle of the 3rd century, Origen has a famous saying in which he talks about the 2 hands of empire. And he talks all about how God arranged the coming of Jesus providentially at the time of Augustus, so that even as Augustus was able to bring peace through conquering enemies across the Mediterranean basin, so Jesus, through his death and resurrection, was able to bring peace to the cosmos by the vanquishing of wicked cosmic powers. And he called this the 2 hands of empire, an empire in heaven and an empire on earth. If we go to read Eusebius, especially, so Eusebius, the 4th century church historian, writing his panegyric to Constantine on the 30th anniversary of his rule in the 330s, Constantine dies in 336. Eusebius dies in 337 CE. We can see Eusebius really using this language also to celebrate sort of the pax of heaven and the pax on the earth that Constantine brings. And you can see these things coming together in this sort of way, right? And of course, if we go further then into, say, the world of European colonialism, we can see how the church adopted this imperial language, and we can see because many of these empires, the German Empire, the British Empire, the American Empire, the French Empire. I mean, one of the things that they do in the age of exploration and discovery and so on from the 15th century onward is that they are heavily steeped in the language of their iconography, often is evocative of Roman Empire. And so as colonization goes underway outside of their orbit by European powers, they bring a very imperial attitude towards the people who are being colonized. And the iconography is very, very striking, where you'll, for example, have representations of First Nations people, indigenous people in North America, for example, on one knee, bowing before a missionary, right? Which is an identical trope to what we find in Roman imperial iconography, where barbarians are bowing before the emperor. I was in Prague a couple of years ago, and I was on the Charles Bridge. And on the Charles Bridge, there are a number of statues that are dedicated to missionaries. And it was extraordinary. And I tried to take a picture, but the sun was in the way, so I could have shown you a picture otherwise. But unfortunately, I'm not able to do that because I couldn't get a clear picture. But it was striking to me that the representation of missionaries, and these were missionaries going now to South America and to North America, going to the Americas, is that you had the identical iconography that you find on these Roman coins, right? With you have a fully clothed European missionary who's standing, and then you have indigenous peoples who are half clothed on their knees with them receiving the Bible. I mean, it was just so extraordinary to me that you could see this long arc spreading from the empire into this imagery of colonization. And my argument would be is that, in fact, the New Testament assisted this movement because of its appropriation of political language, but more importantly, its appropriation of political imagery. So just give one illustration, and then we'll open it up for a discussion so that we can have more time to talk with each other. So we take a look, for example, at Philippians 2, verses 6 to 11. Have this mind that is yours in Christ, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but humbled himself, taking the form of a slave, right? And being obedient even unto death on the cross. Wherefore he has been highly exalted, so that every knee will bow and tongue confess that Jesus is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. So here you have an image of the crucifixion of Jesus and his exaltation. And then you have the image of every knee bowing and every tongue confessing that Jesus is Lord. So the image of every knee bowing, of course, is a very vivid image. And people who would have heard this text in the Roman colony of Philippi, which had all sorts of imperial iconography, had all sorts of coinage with representations of barbarians, conquered peoples on their knees, giving honor to the emperor, right? This is the image that would have come to mind. Now, obviously, there's also Hebrew Bible imagery that's there, and I don't have any quarrel with Paul, springboarding off Hebrew Bible imagery. But in the first instance, the lived reality of these people is not in a Hebrew Bible concordance, right? Like they don't have a Hebrew Bible concordance. What they have is they have vivid memory generated by the imagery around them that Paul is using in order to evoke a mental image of what he's talking about here, right? So here we have this image of conquered peoples, but now it's people worshiping in adoration of God in Christ. And of course, the paradoxical juxtaposition here is that whereas the emperor rules by violence, here the Son of God has emptied himself and taken on the form of a slave and been obedient unto death, even death on a cross. So and this is very, very paradoxical, right? So one of your teachers, Larry Welburn, in a really, really beautiful essay, you should get Larry Welburn on here. He writes this. He wrote this essay on crucifixion in the ancient world, and he makes the point persuasively that in the first century, crucifixion was not a word that you even spoke aloud. That's not a word that people spoke in polite company, right? It was a word that was a shameful word to say, maybe in a way that today it might be a cuss word, right? Or a profane word. And yet here what Paul is doing is he's taking this word that is not spoken in polite company and he's putting it right at the very center of his theology, and he's organizing political language all around this vivid, shameful image, and that is really, really amazing, amazingly paradoxical, and amazingly provocative. And of course, it's ironic then that, of course, all of this then gets turned around and put on its head so that it comes to endorse a kind of a Roman imperial order, albeit under a European guise. So I think that's a good example of kind of what I'm talking about here. And we can see all sorts of Roman imperial imagery that would express that. So I'll leave that now. I hope I said it enough to give us a good conversation. And over to you.
Wow, it's very, very rich lecture, Professor Maier, because you talk about like the hermeneutics and also the social condition at Paul's time, who is it, and also how Paul's want to shape his reader like that. It's very cool, very rich discussion. Cool. But however, before I want to give time to my friend, I have one question, Professor Maier. So, wait. So, as far as I know, from Roman 13, verse 1, I think you already mentioned this verse on your lecture. As far as I know, sometimes the church interpret, I don't know, especially in Indonesia, as far as I know, the church interpret the text as full submission to the government, like that. So you must submit to your government. But I am wondering, what if the empire do cultural violence or malicious things to its citizen? I mean, it's like a contradicting how we must submit, but if we know there's a cultural violence or the government do malicious things, how do we do? I mean, that's the question that I was thinking.
Absolutely.
When I hearing your lecture.
So I think we can answer this question in a variety of ways. We can answer this question by reference to what the larger context of Romans chapter 13 is, from Romans chapters 12 and 13. We can also answer this question canonically by talking about canonical theology. So maybe I'll take the second aspect first, then go back to Romans chapter 13. Okay, so the first thing that we need to know, of course, is that the companion piece to Romans chapter 13 is the book of Revelation. And it's very important that we look at the overall biblical witness and the overall biblical testimony to political authority. I could have given a talk. One of my other expertises is the book of Revelation, and I write about vivid imagery in the book of Revelation as well. And I could have talked away about how the book of Revelation also adopts imperial imagery and engages in an even more dramatic inversion of it. And there, right, we have the writer of the book of John the Revelator would never in a billion years have said that you should either pray for the emperor or pay taxes to the emperor or obey the emperor's laws. That's not would have been that would have been very out of place in the Apocalypse of John, not the kind of language you would find there. So it's very important then to have that text over against the Romans chapter 13 text and read canonically. Right. And so while it's true that people have said that you should obey the government because the Bible says so, it's important to say also, well, yes, and the Bible also calls the oppressive forces of the government, say in 1 John, the spirit of Antichrist, and in the book of Revelation, the beast, right? So, and of course, the more prophetic side of Christianity, say liberation theology that's also looked at the more radical apocalyptic invocations of the historical Jesus, develops a very different political hermeneutic. So I think that's very, very important. The second point, then, back to Paul in Romans chapter 13, verse 1, is that, of course, we never just do theology by proof texting. We never do theology by saying, there it is, Romans chapter 13, verse 1, and next question, right? Romans chapter 13, verse 1 needs to be really located within the larger sweep of Romans chapters 12 to 15. And I think that what Paul is doing in Romans 12 to 15 is he's actually using a lot of political language in Romans 12, 1 to chapter 15. And he's identifying what an ideal community looks like. And an ideal, and he's drawing there on political rhetoric to describe what an ideal community is. So in chapter 12, of course, he uses the image of the body, which is a political device, the body politic. We still have this language we have this expression in the English language, the body politic, which comes directly from the ancient world, from Aristotle onward. And he's talking, using political language to develop the idea of what concord looks like. So one of the ancient values, one of the most cherished ancient civic values was concord or harmony, right? Or the Greek word is homonoia. And I think that what Paul is developing in Romans 12 to 15 is an image of what homonoia looks like. And in the ancient world, concord was always about peace with the gods and peace with your neighbor. Peace with the gods, so there's a vertical dimension and a horizontal dimension. Right? We find this already in the Hebrew Bible, for example. It's a very ancient notion. Civic peace or civic prosperity or social prosperity arises when the relationship with the gods is right. Right, so we find this in the two tables of the law of the 10 Commandments. You know, your relationship with God, the first 3 commandments, your relationship with your neighbor, commandments 4 to 10. So we see the same basic idea, right? So Paul is trying to articulate here that when there is right relationship with God in Christ, there is right social relationship. Right. And right social relationship then means a set of virtues. Right. So I think that the key element of Romans chapter 13 is that the sword of Caesar is a risk, is a threat to those who break the law, not to those who keep the law. Right. And so Paul here, I think, is using language to talk all about social harmony and cohesion within the group. And as part of that, he's using the device of paying your taxes to the emperor, because that's part of the image, what a socially cohesive group looks like. They're not filled with strife. In other words, the sword is not going to threaten them because they're illegal, because they're doing illegal things, right? Paul then goes on to talk about a list of vices against which the sword is a threat, right? The sword of Caesar is a threat. So it's very, very important then in Romans chapter 13, verse 1 to contextualize this. And this would still make my point, although it comes about in a rather circular or kind of circuitous kind of way. It still makes my point, right? That Paul is drawing on a wider repertoire of imagery, political imagery, in order to create an image in the mind of his listeners of what a cohesive community living in harmony looks like. Now, so Paul is not calling for some kind of quietism, over against the Roman Empire. He's not calling people to turn a blind eye to tyranny. He's not calling for people to accept the unjust civil order as just the way it is, right? That's not what is going on in Romans chapter 13, verse 1. The rhetoric of Romans chapter 13, verse 1 is really contained within chapters 12 to 15, where, in fact, I think that if one follows the ethic of Romans chapters 12 to 15, in fact, one becomes quite radical, and I expect one becomes quite radically engaged with the structures of injustice that would have been present in the Roman Empire, right? And so Paul talks about the weak and the strong, for example, and inverts the hierarchy, the social hierarchy. So, I mean, Adrianos, I've given you probably a 10-minute answer to a 2-minute question, but I think that's the way to think about that text.
Well, thank you. That's what is it? Enlightening me.
Okay.
Cool. Yeah, maybe Franz, do you have any thoughts? Oh, Iman, please.
Hi, Dr. Harry.
Hello.
First of all, thank you for being here on Theovlogy, and I'm glad to see you. And also, I'm so proud of you because you are my professor at Vancouver School of Theology.
Oh, thank you.
So I have a question for you because, I have a question for you because as you have said that Paul is the person living in the Roman Empire, and he used the vivid speech to evoke the set of emotions to the readers. And I'm wondering, how does this vivid speech give impact to the way Paul understood the world at his time? Because I want to give one example from Ephesians chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. There Paul said, "You were dead through the trespasses and sins in which you once lived, following the course of this world, following the ruler of the power of the air, the spirit that is now at work among those who are disobedient." So I'm wondering if this idea actually comes from the way Paul understood the cosmos or the world at his time, or is this kind of a vivid speech, an example of vivid speech that Paul developed because of his understanding of the world in the Roman Empire?
Yes, that's absolutely an image of vivid speech. That's absolutely correct. That's an image of that's an example of vivid speech. So I think that this is also something that is quite different from the cosmology of Paul. Is of course completely different from the cosmology of those of us who live in the post-Enlightenment West. I think that people who are living in other countries, for example, again in India, or countries in which there is a belief in a lot of different kinds of cosmic powers, are much closer to the ancient worldview of that Paul had, right? And I think that Paul mentions a hierarchical cosmos where the God of Israel is at the top, but he imagines that there are a whole other host of cosmic powers, right? And that there are other gods, but that these other gods are subservient to God. So I don't think that Paul imagines that these are all just fictions or these things don't really exist, but I think that he sees a cosmos that is thick with cosmic powers, right? And these cosmic powers, they have, for Paul, they kind of have a twofold role to play. On the one hand, though they are hostile to God, I think that Paul sees them as in some way keeping a kind of a social order. And the social order is kept by offering sacrifices to them and trying to obey them and so on and so forth. In the intertestamental literature, we have references to the Lord God appointing an angel to govern each nation, but the Lord God himself is selecting Israel to be Israel's God, right? So there you have an idea of God using cosmic powers to govern the nations, but God directly governing Israel itself, okay? So this means that Paul can talk about all these hostile powers and the powers of the air and so on. So by the air, of course, what he means is that this thick cosmos, because we should imagine a world of cosmic powers in kind of arranged in a sort of a set of beings where you get to the highest God at the top, right? Which is the Lord God of Israel. And that the world is being governed by these powers, and they do God's bidding in the sense that they still keep a kind of an order, but on the other hand, they are also leading to idolatry. And in that sense, they're wicked because they arrogate to themselves the authority to be worshipped that should only be given to God to be worshipped, right? So, and on account of that, Paul imagines their coming defeat, that they have already been defeated through the death of Jesus on the cross, but there is an ultimate defeat of them coming because of the present order of this world is passing away, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, I think it is, right? 1 Corinthians chapter 11. I'm trying to think about the passage where he says the form of this world is passing away when he's talking about slavery. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. So it's vivid speech, and it's vivid speech in which Paul is very much talking about the cosmic world around him, but he's also wanting to make a larger theological claim. Now, in the Roman world, of course, the Roman Empire believes that the emperor has been installed by these cosmic powers in order to administer the Roman Empire. And because he is pleasing to the pantheon of the gods have given Augustus authority to rule the earth, or Augustus's descendants, whatever our emperor is going, to rule the earth. And here, there would be the idea that the political authorities are those powers that are also, although God may have initially installed or ultimately installed, right? Nevertheless, they are under the influence of all of these different cosmic powers, right? So it's political speech, it's political imagery, it's part of the cosmos of the ancient world. And it nevertheless wants to preserve a priority given over to Christ, and especially in Ephesians, because Ephesians is so highly Christological. I hope that answers that.
Okay, please. You can collaborate,
Dr.
both of
Maier.
you.
Nindya, go ahead if you want to say something.
No,
okay.
You go go ahead.
Dr. Maier, first of all, I really appreciate your presentation, and if I'm rightly hear you, actually you want to say that we need to read the imperial rhetorics in each New Testament letters or writings separately from one author to another, because I think that the problem that you also mentioned is coming from how some scholars not really try to separate each authors, and then they just say that, oh, those authors using this imperial rhetorics, and then saying the same things, right? So I really appreciate what you're saying. But then if I'm also hear you rightly, you also want to say that by using the imperial language, Paul actually is not starkly opposing the imperial power at the first place, but drawing that language to explain his message and to invite his readers to imagine about his intention. And this is right. And this is also the purpose also to create a vivid depictions and striking images about his intention. And you also mentioned about strategy of ancient persuasion and inviting emotion, like
Yes.
Iman already asked.
Yeah.
And but then this is
Mhm.
my question. There are two questions from me. Do you want to say that Paul's message or messages are different or separate from his means or strategy that he used, which is the imperial rhetorics? Or in other words, the language that he used is not to confronting the Roman worship for Caesar, for example, but to give an analogy for Christ's worship by using that imperial rhetorics. So in other words, there is no intention at all from Paul's side to use that rhetoric for critique the imperial power, because this is the thing, Dr. Maier. I remember I read N.T. Wright's book about the resurrection of the Son of God.
Yeah.
I think it's 5 or 6 years ago, and at the very beginning, he mentioned
Right.
about Roman letters, and then he mentioned about the social and political situation at that time, where the Christians, the lower Christian in social status, they live just directly in
Right.
front of the, what is it, seven hills, right? And then he says, I think if I'm rightly, I remember that he says that by using the imperial rhetoric, for example, like saying Jesus as Lord, Paul already has in mind something that is very subversive for
Right.
Roman Empire, while writing that in his letter. So I don't know, but this is really intriguing for
Yeah.
me. And then I don't know
Absolutely.
if
Yeah.
I'm right saying this,
Right.
Dr.
Yeah.
Maier.
So just let me say
Thanks for your
straight off the bat, no, I think Wright is wrong about this. Wright is wrong. I like that. I always like to say when Wright is wrong. No, I think that Wright, Tom Wright has used the imperial cult to overdetermine his reading of Paul. I think that it's a rather romantic picture that he has of Paul. And it's a picture of Paul that really fits into the story that the church has liked to tell itself over the last 2,000 years, especially the story that the church has liked to tell itself about the early church, namely that you have all of these people who are getting up every morning and thinking about how bad the Roman Empire is and how idolatrous it is, and how they're all going to oppose this, and they're all going to go singing to their deaths in the Colosseum as the lions devour them. Which makes for great movies and perhaps some good New Testament bestsellers, but doesn't really do well with history, I think. So I think that we need to talk about what is a main message, and we need to then talk about what is a consequence of a main message. Okay, so I think that Paul's main message is not about opposition to the Roman Empire. I don't think that Paul is waking up and looking out around himself all around the world and saying, wow, look at that damn Roman emperor with his dastardly imperial cult, and man, boy, is God going to get you. And I'm going to write this letter here, looking at the statue of Caesar here, to say, wow, this is the end of you, buddy, kind of thing. That's not really where Paul is at. But I do think that a consequence of the way that Paul writes, the way that Paul imagines, right, is that I think that Paul thinks that the cult to the emperor is idolatrous. I think that Paul thinks that the entire Gentile world is idolatrous, and the Roman imperial cult would be one example of idolatry, but he could have pointed to many, many different forms of idolatry in the ancient world. And the Roman imperial cult would be good evidence that these inimical powers, or these hostile powers, have creation in its grip, right? In this kind of paradoxical way that I just talked about with Iman. So Paul would not want to endorse any of these things, but I think that when Paul is writing, he's seeing the entire thing to be swept away, and that includes the cult of the emperor. But I think that Wright has really really overemphasized this, and actually in his recent 2-volume tome, he actually goes at some length to say how his earlier scholarship has too overdetermined the imperial cult, and that he's come to a differing set of conclusions about this. But I do think that he still nevertheless returns to this way of thinking and imagining Paul. So I think that the picture is a lot more complicated than this simple kind of binary between Paul and empire. Right. That's why I want to say that Paul is implicated is implicated in empire, and Paul is engaging with empire, and Paul is opposed to the Roman Empire in some ways and not opposed to the Roman Empire in other ways. Paul is happy to use Greek language. Paul is happy to use Roman roads. Paul is happy to use his other transportation systems. Paul is benefiting from the peace on the Mediterranean basin that allows him to travel and to spread his message. Paul benefits from the law that he can invoke in his favor, right? So I think that when we talk about Paul being opposed to the cult of Caesar or Paul being opposed to Caesar, we need to be careful, well, in what ways is he opposed to this? And I think that this, the result of this creates a very interesting paradigm for Christians, because Christians can be opposed to a ruler and still pray for a ruler, right? Christians can be opposed to the overarching political order and still obey law, right? So this means that Christians have always had to deal with, well, how do we live within an order, a civil order that we're opposed to? And this, of course, calls for Christians to have enormous courage. I think it was some of the early Christian apologists, I think it might have been Minucius Felix, in his Apology for Christianity, he argues against his opponent that Christians are the best citizens because Christians are willing to tell the emperor when he's wrong. And Christians pray for the emperor, right, for his well-being. And what kind of citizen is willing to tell the emperor that he's wrong? Or that might have been Tertullian. But in any case, this is what establishes this kind of paradoxical aspect. So I don't think that Paul is then just kind of adopting the language of the imperial cult in order to oppose the imperial cult. Paul is adopting the imagery, the language of the imperial cult to make his language persuasive, which has an implication of opposition to the imperial cult. That's how I would interpret that. It might even be on YouTube. A few years ago at the SBL, there was a very spirited conversation between John Barclay and N.T. Wright on this very question. And Barclay just dismantled Tom Wright in front of 500 people. And which is very interesting. And I talked with John Barclay about this, and I said, like that was really interesting, and he said, yeah, well, he said, when you debate Tom Wright, he said, you don't come out with a nuanced position. You have to really come out swinging, because he swings very hard back at you. And if you go, well, I kind of take your point here and take your point there, it's just conceding too much ground. You have to really come out hard
Oh,
And it's very, very interesting. So if you Google John Barclay,
is it available on YouTube, Dr. Maier?
I think it might be.
Okay.
I think it might be. And if it's not available on YouTube, there's certainly, it was sort of like a legendary moment in the history of the Society of Biblical Literature. That was certain because, because wherever Tom Wright shows up,
thank you.
yeah, wherever Tom Wright
Interesting.
shows up, he has hundreds, if not thousands, of disciples that show up with him.
You're right.
And so he's like the oracle, and it was very, very interesting. They were actually both there to respond to Robert Jewett's commentary on Romans.
Mhm.
Robert Jewett had just published his commentary on Romans, and they were both there to respond to his commentary on Romans. And that's where Barclay decided to take a piece out of N.T. Wright while he was at it. I think I'm really persuaded by Barclay, and I think Barclay and I really agree about this aspect of Paul and political language. That opposition to the Roman Empire is, Paul. We need to talk about what we mean when we talk about opposition to the Roman Empire. Was Paul opposed to the idolatry of the imperial cult? Well, of course, Paul was opposed to the idolatry of the Roman imperial cult. Was Paul thinking every day, damn, the imperial cult's really bad, I'm going to talk about how bad the Roman imperial cult is? No, that's not what he did. And, one of the difficulties then is for determining the Roman imperial cult is now you begin to have readings of Romans that are all opposed to that every single letter of Paul in some ways some kind of veiled attack on the Roman imperial cult. And then sometimes you even have this idea of the so-called hidden transcript. And the hidden transcript is this idea that was borrowed from James Scott, and basically who's an anthropologist looking at Indonesian culture, if you know about the hidden transcript. And he says that people who are in great experiences of oppression, they will speak in veiled language. They will use irony, ironical gestures, and so on and so forth to express their dissent against an oppressive power that allows them to express their dissent even while not being punished for it, the hidden transcript, right? So now you have New Testament scholars who, even though the New Testament there is not at all talking in any way, so far as you can tell on the plain reading of the text, about the Roman Empire or Caesar or whatever, that everything is just a hidden transcript, right? And then it becomes a kind of a form of allegorical reading, right? It's another form of allegorical exegesis. So you've got books on the Gospel of John, which, so far as I can tell, the Gospel of John is not very concerned about the Roman Empire at all. I mean, it's very difficult for me to see that the Gospel of John is very concerned about the Roman Empire, but yet it becomes with the hermeneutical sort of like the magic ring or decoder ring, which you shine on the text. Somehow you see this is all a great, vast allegory against the Roman Empire. And to me, it's just really not persuasive. Yeah. And another wrinkle on that is then post-colonial exegesis comes into play, and post-colonial hermeneutics come into play. So now that you've got, it's a hidden transcript and it's against the Roman Empire, now you say, and the reason why they're doing this is because they are in colonial situations of Roman imperially occupied lands, and they're having to do this, and really they're engaging in some kind of, Homi Baba-like hybridity, and so on and so forth. And, and the problem is that the whole thing just becomes an absolutely circular kind of argument. So I don't want to dismiss the idea that these people are living under, Roman occupation. I don't want to dismiss this idea that it's an oppressive government. I don't want to dismiss the idea it's a violent government. I'm not wanting to say any of those things. I mean, or that these writers think that this order is idolatrous and is going to be swept away by God. I don't want to deny any of that. I just think that these kinds of tools of exegesis have been they're so heavy-handed, and they kind of force these texts to be these things And the reason why I think that they're forcing these things to be this way gets us back into the culture war that I started off with at the very start. Right?
Just one small comment, Dr. Maier.
Sure,
I think, thank you so much for this clarification, because I think, like I said earlier, the problem here is that some scholars or even some Christians really easily tend toward or orient towards like a simple generalization, right? I mean, and then like, for example, like 2 weeks ago, we, in one of my class here, we read from Suslar Fiorenza.
Yes.
And you mentioned also about post-colonial hermeneutics, because she used that kind of, and then from my reading, I perceive that she's kind of like doing also this simple generalization, right? Like, and then not really like trying to see what is this particular order wants to say about the imperial rhetorics here. And I mean, I really appreciate your approach here. Thank you so much, Dr. Maier.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
So I mean, I want to say that, you know, in no way am I some kind of conservative political guy, in no way whatsoever. That's not, you know, I don't have a horse in the race of conservative politics or anything like that. I want Paul to be radical. Believe me, I want Paul to be really radical. You know, the more radical Paul is, better.
Yeah.
You know, I'm just saying that though.
Yes.
I have to allow Paul to be whoever Paul is. I just can't kind of shoehorn Paul into my kind of way that I want Paul to be. There's reasons to love Paul. There's reasons to hate Paul. And you know, and it's important to love him and hate him for the right reasons. But I don't think that we should love Paul because he thought that, man, the cult of Caesar is really bad, and everything I'm going to give over all of my attention to the cult of Caesar to undermine it as much as possible. Yeah, I would love it if Paul had done that, but he didn't. I don't think he did.
And also sometimes I think some Christians love that because it's fit with our political agenda too, right? Like, I mean, right now.
Yeah, of course. And I think that feeds again back into this culture war that we're found in.
You're right. Thank you, Dr. Maier. Thank you so much.
For sure.
Yeah, there's a question for the audience, Professor Maier. First from Wiwi Chandra. He said, "Thank you, Professor Maier, for the new insight. Never thought before about using vivid imagery or speech to study Paul's writings." And she has a question. She said,
"Very good.
In my limited understanding, many centuries before the Reformation, only the clergymen who have access to reading and interpreting the Bible." Said that. How this practice was developed, and do you think this practice also have influence in what you call as endorsing Roman Empire in contemporary time? Maybe the elitist side, maybe, of the interpreting the Bible.
Right. Exactly. Yes, you're exactly right about that. So it's exactly the case that it's only clergymen. In fact, it's right. It's called them clergymen because they're only men. Priests who are reading the Bible, right? And of course, one of the Reformation, one of the consequences of the Reformation from Wycliffe onward, from the 14th century onward, there are other people who are translating language in the Bible into European languages, was that lay people should read the Bible, right? How this developed, of course, I think is because Latin, in the Roman Catholic Church in the medieval period, from Jerome onward, the Vulgate, the Latin translation of the Bible, was the one that was being used by the church, and people didn't speak Latin anymore. So obviously they couldn't read the Bible if they were literate at all. And like literacy, we're talking about maybe 10% of people who are literate. So by literacy, I mean somebody who could read the Bible. Right. There's lots of levels of literacy. Somebody can write their name. Somebody can read a recipe. Somebody can read a sign. That's another form of literacy. But if we're talking about literacy as in the levels of ability to read a sacred text or any text like the Bible, then we're talking about 10% of the population, probably. So if we're looking at the ancient world, we should also imagine very, very low levels of literacy. And that means that, again, we're living in an oral culture, right? So that we are communicating by what we hear, and we're communicating also by what we see. Let me see what Wiwi had another. Is it Chandra or Wiwi? the name Chandra Wiwi, because she had a second part of her question. I just want to make sure I get the second part. Wiwi, if I can see the second part of her question, yes.
Wiwi.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yes, absolutely. This has a characteristic of endorsing the Roman Empire. Well, in the medieval period, bishops and so on are heavily implicated in structures of feudal political power. So we can imagine then that the Bible is going to be interpreted in ways that are not going to try to upset the feudal order, and is going to continue to endorse the power of princes. In our contemporary period, things are a little bit more complicated now, because you have religious communities that are developing certain strategies, certain kinds of strategies of reading the Bible, right? And you can have these strategies, or kind of like a communal hermeneutic that's developed, so that a community is shaped together by pastors or a denomination to read the Bible in a particular kind of way. In that case, then we would go back to Adrianus's question about Romans chapter 13, verse 1, to really foreground Romans chapter 13, verse 1, or 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 and following, about praying, or to 2:1 and following, about praying for the emperor, right? And really foregrounding these kinds of texts, and not paying attention, for example, very much to the book of Revelation. Or on the other hand, you can have communities that are heavily steeped in apocalyptic and read the book of Revelation all the time, and gain their credibility through convincing people that the world is about to end any moment now, and neglect the ways in which this is also a deeply political text, right? And so in both of these instances, you can be a kind of a participant in the political order without really questioning it. In one case, you don't question it because God installed it. In the other case, you don't question it in any really important life-changing way, because it's all about to come to an end, right? And you're just waiting for Jesus to rescue you from history. So both of these strategies can be very endorsing of the political order, one directly, the other rather more paradoxically so, but nevertheless realistically or effectively or practically. So that's a great question. I hope I've answered your question, Wiwi.
Yep. And maybe this is a short comment from Arvin. He said that, as Dr. Maier, would your reading be in line with the apocalyptic school, or more in line with the mystical apocalyptic reading as proposed by Rowland, Murray Jones, also as Bill groups? Thanks.
Right. Right. Rowland with the open heaven. Chris Rowland is a guy who's really, really interested in politics. And I'm sure that he would be the first one to say that mysticism is not necessarily apolitical. And he's really wanting to draw attention to the experiential aspects and so on and so forth. And I think we want to have both, really. I'm not really kind of I'm not really seeing a strong distinction between these. So in the case of Paul, I think we can have a mystical Paul, and I think we can have an apocalyptic Paul, and I think they can both inhabit the same person quite easily, actually. And so, but the one thing that I would avoid is the idea that Paul is a mystic quietist. I don't think that Paul is a mystic quietist. I think that Paul has a very profound ethic that really talks about the giving up of power for others. And I think that if that is not, even if Paul does not say, and this is really kind of completely, totally different from the Roman Empire around you, I think that that is embedded there, that you could not be a member of the socio-political order and hear Paul's message and practice Paul's message without in some way really engaging in fundamental reversal of the social order. Right. We take for granted, I mean, we in the West, and I don't know what it's like in Indonesia, but we in the West kind of take for granted the ideas of charity, the idea that, you know, you should be giving money to the civic good, et cetera, et cetera. We kind of take all of these things for granted. In the ancient world, there's no such thing about taking that for granted. Right. I've got a friend who's writing a book that is wanting to talk about the ways that rich and poor lived alongside each other in the Roman world and just lived different realities, realities that really didn't really intersect with each other. The genius of the New Testament, as well as the Hebrew Scriptures, is that it does not allow us to live in a world where these realities don't intersect with each other. In fact, we are required in obeying God that these realities are continually intersecting each other. And because I think that the Hebrew Scriptures in the New Testament is so instructive for Islam and for the Quran as well, I think that that's embedded in the Quran also, though I'm no Islam or Quran specialist, but I think the DNA is there. Right.
By the way, there's a response from Vivi. He said that thank you for the great answer, Prof. Maier.
Okay, Vivi. You know, I'm a bit confused by your name because I have a student from Indonesia named Chandra. So, yeah. So, in any case, Wiwi, you're not Chandra, you're Wiwi. Very good. Okay. Okay.
And also, there are two short questions, Professor Maier. Then I think this is the last question from the audience.
Okay.
She said that, thanks, Professor Maier. Then she said that, I'm just curious, what is the meaning of Israel for you now? And the second question, so short, she said that, how Paul said about slavery?
Right, exactly. So when you say the meaning of Israel for me right now, you don't mean the state of Israel. You mean what constitutes Israel. That's what you mean theologically. What is the meaning of Israel theologically for me? I'm taking that you're not asking me about Israeli politics and Palestine. But if you are, just stop me, and then I'll just stop saying what I'm about to say, because I can talk about that, though I'm no political scientist. So I would say that we've got two views of Israel in the New Testament, at least two views of Israel in the New Testament. We can say that one probably is represented by the Epistle to the Hebrews, and we can say the other one is represented by Romans. In the one case, Israel is a church, and the other one, Israel is expanded to include Gentiles. And I think that, here I take a fundamental disagreement from N.T. Wright as well. Paul and the Faithfulness of God, I take a fundamental disagreement with him. I side with people like Paula Friedrichsen, Amy Jo Levine, Paula Eisenbaum, Jewish New Testament scholars who argue that Paul never imagined the supplanting of Israel by Christ believers. Paul imagined the inclusion of Christ believers into Israel. Paul says, I don't know what God is doing with Israel. I thought God was doing this with Israel, Romans chapter 11, sort of like, damned if I know what God is doing with Israel. I thought this was going to happen. And, clearly that's not really happening right now. But this is what I hope, right? In other words, God has God's covenant with Israel, but God is not revoking God's covenant with Israel. God is not tweaking God's covenant with Israel. God is not doing some kind of abracadabra with Israel so that now suddenly, what God had promised Abraham and his descendants is now suddenly changed so that Abraham and his descendants are just Christ believers, which would be the position of Tom Wright. No, I think that when Paul says all Israel will be saved, he means all Israel will be saved. And when he asks, how is it that all Israel will be saved? Paul basically says, oh, the mysteries of God, oh, the riches of the mysteries of God. I don't know how that's going to happen. And what does it even mean for Israel to be saved as well? Paul is really concerned about Gentiles. Paul is really, really concerned about Gentiles. So Israel, for me, in the New Testament, a la Romans, is an expanded notion. And probably we have a kind of an image of this, though it's inflected differently in the book of Acts, where the gospel extends from Jerusalem to Samaria to the ends of the earth. And there's always a kind of a temple-centric idea. Everybody's going back to the temple in the book of Acts. Hebrews really talks about the abrogation of a covenant that's obsolete and replacing it with a new covenant. And I would say that is a theology about Israel that I would think is very, very opposed to what Paul is talking about. And the second question was, what did Paul say about slavery?
Slavery.
Well, here, here we really are right back in this world about Paul and the Roman Empire. So, example, in the Epistle to Philemon. Okay, so firstly, we have the theory that Philemon is a letter telling Philemon to receive back a runaway slave. There's not really any evidence, I think, any compelling evidence that Philemon is a runaway slave. That Onesimus is a runaway slave. And there are a lot of reasons why Onesimus could have come to Paul and why Paul is sending him back no longer as a slave, but as a brother. That language could be interpreted in a lot of ways, and we don't have time to go there right now. I think that for Paul, slavery is one of those institutions that is part of the social fabric, in the same way that capitalism is part of the social fabric of our day. Paul wants to say that whether you're slave or free, no bearing on your being a child of Abraham, just as whether you're a female or a male doesn't, just as whether you're a Jew or a Gentile doesn't have a bearing. So in this case, for women, for slaves, for Gentiles, on being children of Abraham, right? Paul says that people should use the institutions of manumission that are available to them to be free so far as possible. I think that Paul is seeing the institution of slavery to be swept away in the new age to come. And I think that this is one of the ways in which Paul is rather more conservative than we would have liked him to be. That Paul does not endorse slavery, but neither is Paul wishing to overthrow the institution of slavery. I think that Paul's mission in some ways requires slavery. And what I mean by this is that, for example, when he receives the letter from the Corinthians, he receives the letter from the Corinthians from Chloe's people who have been sent who have been sent with the letter to Paul. So who are Chloe's people? Well, probably Chloe's people are probably slaves, Chloe's slaves who are traveling on behalf of their master, right? Or Chloe may not be a Christ believer or Christ follower, but the slaves may be Christ followers. And while they're doing her business, they also deliver a letter from Paul, right? And so this is just kind of part of the social fabric. It's unimaginable for me to see a world in which slavery could in any way be endorsed or even tacitly endorsed or acknowledged or not be called into question or not be radically called into question. And I think that in the world of Paul, slavery was such a ubiquitous reality that it was not called into question in the same way that it would be called into question by all of us who are gathered here today. So there we have to allow Paul to be a man of his time without endorsing what he may have taken for granted. Of course, what happened in the Civil War, in the antebellum South in the years leading up to the Civil War, as well as in the long debate over slavery in the British Empire, is that all of these texts were used to say that Paul really is God, God willed that there be slaves. I don't think that Paul would have said God willed that there would be slaves. I think just Paul said there are slaves.
Oh,
I hope that's rather difficult. That may be difficult for you to hear.
but I think that's Paul.
Yeah. I think we have to take these writers with the good, the bad, and the ugly. I think we need to take it all together and not just kind of make them into images of what we would like them to have been. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you still have time? So maybe Nindyo have a response.
Yeah, right. I'm not doing anything until midnight, so go ahead.
Yeah, maybe the last question will be Nindyo's.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, this is the last question, I think. So thank you, Dr. Maier. My question is very simple. How would you suggest to those people who love Jesus but not Paul? For instance, many even theological students and professors, they teach Paul. They teach Jesus the Gospels, saying that this is what Christians must follow, but not Paul. Well, I come from the Anabaptist tradition, which really love not only Jesus but the Sermons on the Mount. But
we hate Paul.
When it comes Paul and Pauline letters, this is so too oblique, too murky, too vague, and we don't care about Paul. And even in Indonesia, I heard that Paul was not taught in some schools because of Paul is not Jesus's disciple. How would you suggest to these people?
I love Jesus and Wesley.
Right, yeah, Jesus and Wesley. Oh, you have to remember that you're talking to a Lutheran here, and Paul is our guy. So you're going to get a heavily distorted. You're going to get a heavily distorted answer here. So it's hard for me to imagine not working with Paul. It's virtually unimaginable for me. So I have to really try to imagine what that world kind of looks like. Because for us Lutherans, the great thing about Jesus is that Jesus agreed so much with Paul. That's the kind of thing, why we like Jesus so much is because he agreed with Paul so much. So, I think that we have to back up here in this question, and we have to ask a kind of a prior question before we can talk about whether we should believe Jesus instead of Paul. We have to ask the question, how much are the Gospels biographies of Jesus? How much are the Gospels the very words of Jesus? And how much are the Gospels theological representations of Jesus as he was experienced and known and lived 40 to 60 years after his death and resurrection? This is a fundamental question we have to ask. And so, obviously, if you think that the Gospels are the very words of Jesus, the actual historical, literal reports of what Jesus historically did, then you're going to come to a different answer on this, right? But because I think that the Gospels are theological representations of the memory of Jesus as developed for communities who are expressing the meaning of the Easter Jesus in their communities living 30 to 60 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus, I don't see then that we should follow Jesus and not Paul. In fact, on my view, Paul would be the earliest testament to Jesus in the New Testament, not the Gospels. Okay. And behind me, I've got like 250 years of biblical scholarship on that point. And obviously, while that, I hope that's not an atomic bomb that I just put out there that is exploding people and they're turning off their computer because they think they're listening to a heretic right now. But I think you have to ask the prior question. You really do have to ask the prior question. And so I would argue that in some instances, and this has been argued by a number of people like my friend Marie Becker, for example, at the University of Munster, would argue that Mark is working with Paul. The Gospel of Mark is working with Paul. Now, if the Gospel of Mark is working with Paul and on basic New Testament scholarship, Matthew and Luke are copying from Mark, right? Then they're working with Paul too. In other words, Pauline DNA is already there. Pauline DNA is in the Jesus of the Gospels. If we want to say, well, yeah, okay, but I want to go with the historical Jesus. I want to go with the historical Jesus. Well, then we've got a whole other set of problems. Now, I don't want to be the German theologian, that just wants to create 1,000 different epistemological problems for people to deal with before they ever read the Bible. I don't want to be that guy. But anybody who knows anything about any critical scholarship about the New Testament will know, and anybody who's been to, I think, a kind of a mainstream theological seminary will know that these Gospels and so on came about through a historical process, and they're not the reports of eyewitness followers of Jesus. I mean, that sounds radical. I'm sure that sounds radical to some people. That may even sound heretical or like godless to some people, but that just really is mainstream scholarship that is not conceived by heretics or liberals, but is just kind of mainstream theology that has very, very strong warrant for it. So, I'm not trying to attack the Bible, I'm not trying to attack the Gospels, and certainly not trying to attack Jesus. And I'm certainly not a false teacher that is prophesied who's going to come in the last days, as some people often accuse Christians and pastors, because I've been the pastor who has preached, and I've been accused as being one of the false teachers that come in the last days. With their lying, deceitful theology, So, and I think that pastors generally know what that is like to receive that kind of, to be on the receiving end of that kind of thing. And then, there's no arguing with that. So it's a false choice. Let me just say it's a false choice in a word. I've been going on and on about this. And I've been doing a lot of throat clearing while I've been talking here, as it were. Qualification, just because it's not that I want to be equivocal. It's that I know that a lot of people who are listening to this may go say, "What did you just say?" So I just, I'm not wanting to blow people out of the water here. But it would be a mistake. It would be a profound mistake to ignore Paul. Okay, so. It would be a profound mistake to ignore Paul, because the majority of the New Testament is either written by Paul or ascribed to Paul, right? So what are you going to do then with, albeit a Pauline text that says every scripture is inspired by God? Are you just going to say, well, the Gospels are, but not the rest? That's really playing pretty loose and easy with the canon and with the church's received scriptures. So that would be a mistake. And the other thing I would say is that it's always important to pay attention to things that you don't like and to ask why it is you don't like them. because sometimes you'll learn a lot of things about yourself when you examine the things that you don't like very much. Okay, I hope that's answering the question. I think it's a mistake
But there's
to like Jesus and all. Go ahead.
but I think if you can, Iman have the last question.
Sure. Yes.
Please, Iman.
Yeah, Dr. Harry, thank you for your time. And I have one more question for you. And this question actually has little to do with this topic that we are discussing at the moment. But I think this question is one question that is often asked or debated by among scholars or even among Christians. So I think it's important to ask at this session. And the question is on the Paul's marital status. Why I'm asking you this question, because I remember in Indonesia several months ago that the former governor of Jakarta, who is also a Christian, said that the Paul was married. The Paul was actually married. And this statement is responded by many Christians with various reactions, of course. And some of them say that we don't know for sure if whether Paul was married or not, because the Bible or the text doesn't tell us so. And some of them say that, we are pretty sure that Paul was married because he was one of the members of the Sanhedrin.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he must be married. So I ask you this question so that you may give us insight on it. Thank you.
Sure. Well, all I can say is that I pity the woman that had Paul as a husband. That's the first thing I want to say about that. I pity the woman that had Paul as a husband. He doesn't seem to me to be the easiest. He would have been the easiest guy to get along with in the world. So,
not romantic at all.
Not romantic, and also couldn't seem to express himself clearly if his life depended on it. So Paul does not represent himself as a member of the Sanhedrin. Paul represents himself as a Pharisee, but not a member of the Sanhedrin. Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 that other people have the right to their wives, etc., etc. Other apostles have the right to their wives. Peter, I think, was married, but Paul seems to exclude himself from that. It would be very, very odd for a Jewish male for a Jewish male not to be married. That would be extremely odd. So, all things being equal, without any firm evidence to the contrary, I would say that it would be more likely than not that Paul was married, or more to the point is that Paul may have been a widower. Because mortality, people live to a very low age in the ancient world, especially women, because far larger numbers of women, all things being equal, died in childbirth. And so Paul might have been a widower, or Paul might have been remarried. But simply, so I don't have a horse in the race as to whether Paul was married or not, but I think that the way that Paul describes himself, so Prisca and Aquila, they're tent makers, they're tradespeople, and they're going around plying the same trade that Paul does in the book of Acts, and so it's possible, I suppose, that Paul is also tent making, but there's no with a partner, the way that Prisca and Aquila are a married couple tent making. But Paul never says that It's odd if Paul was like a traveling apostle with another apostle, right? Like Prisca and Aquila are kind of traveling apostles. Then he would have been thrown in jail with his partner, but there's no reference to that anywhere. And that's odd. That's odd that there would be no reference to that. So what I would say then is that if we're just taking reasoning from the general to the particular, in the general world, people would have been married. Paul is part of the general male population. He would have been married. We're dealing with the particular. So in other words, the evidence would weigh in favor of that. On the other hand, if we're looking at the data, Paul expressly says that he denies the right of of a wife, like as the other apostles do. And Paul speaks in the first person, so that would speak against that. So I don't know. I would want to say that Paul was a widower. That's what I would want to say. So you can take that to your politicians out there in Indonesia. And why on earth would a politician want to say that Paul was married? Like what was going on there? That seems like an odd sort of thing to put in a political speech. Do we know why this guy was saying that Paul was married? Do we know this? Or was it just sort of like, is that what Indonesian politicians do? And by the way, while I'm at it, Paul was married.
I don't know why.
Pay your
I don't
taxes.
know why he
Paul
said
was
like
married.
that.
It's okay. So I don't. Anyway, that's odd.
Okay then. Professor Maier, thank you very much for your generosity. And also thank you very much for your wisdom, which you share to us. It's very, very enlightening. And especially for myself, I learned public theology. And I don't know about New Testament, New Perspective on Paul or Old Perspective on Paul, like that. So it's totally new, but it's give me a wisdom.
Okay.
Yeah. Wow, it's cool. Yeah, very enlightening. And yeah, I want to say thank you. And I hope this is not the last. I hope you can.
I'd love to come back here again. Let's do it next week.
Oh, yay! Yeah, and thank you very much for Nindyo, Ferdian, and also Iman, especially Iman who connect us together here. Okay, so I think for Theology friends in Indonesia, thank you very much for watching us, and stay healthy, everyone.
You too. Yeah,
Thank you, Dr.
Yeah.
God bless you all.
Okay.
Okay,
Thank
bye.
you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.